Hi, St. Mark's. The month of March is designated as Women's History Month here in the U.S. And during this month, I would like to look at the role of women in church music. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of the history, and then in the next few weeks, I'll give you more specifics about particular women musicians. For much of history, women were encouraged to learn music for domestic purposes, for playing at home, for enjoyment, to entertain guests when they came over for dinner, but they were never allowed to perform in the concert hall or in church. If you are a Jane Austen fan, maybe you've seen the BBC Pride and Prejudice series where Elizabeth Bennet and Mary Bennet and all the rest learn how to play the piano. But notice they only play at parties or for home. In the church, for far too long, 1 Corinthians 14:34 through 35 has guided this practice of excluding women from music. This scripture says, "Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says." Now, before you go villainizing St. Paul, it is likely that he did not write these verses, but they were added later on to his letter. In many manuscripts, they're written into the margins or at the end of the chapter, rather than being written into the middle of the chapter. But no matter who actually wrote them, they have been used as biblical ammunition to prevent women from singing in church or playing the organ in church or sharing music in any way other than sitting in the pews. Sarah Macdonald, the director of music at Selwyn College in Cambridge University, writes her remembrances about growing up in Canada, where her father and her brothers were able to sing in their local cathedral's choir, but she wasn't because she was a girl. In a narration for a concert she gave a few years ago, she writes about this experience saying, "As a child, I was baffled by this bizarre practice, which was blamed on tradition, presumably backed up by St. Paul. Fortunately, there are now opportunities for girls and women, altos at least, to sing in cathedrals, and there are female priests in the vast majority of the provinces of the Anglican Communion." She continues to point out that although there are increasing opportunities for women to sing in churches and cathedrals, there's still a very small percentage of music sung by these choirs that's written by women. There's certainly still a lot of work to be done, but for now I'm jumping ahead of myself and talking about the modern day without going back in history. So let's start at the very early church. The earliest music of the church was psalm singing, inherited from Jewish synagogue and temple traditions. Gnostic Christians first introduced this style of singing in around 200 AD. Catholic Christians considered the Gnostics to be heretics, because the Gnostics taught that humans are divine souls trapped in the ordinary physical world. Catholic Christians also took on the Gnostic Christian singing. In the year 379, the Synod of Antioch declared that men and women could not sing the same line of music at the same time. As a result, this created a method of psalm singing called Antiphonia, which divided the congregation between men singing one verse and women and children singing the next. They would go back and forth in alternation. If you think about it, when the choir isn't singing the psalm, we go back and forth between the lector and the congregation. This is another form of this antiphonal practice. Dividing psalm verses between men and women would set up a great divide in church music between men and women that would continue for centuries. The earliest singing schools set up in the church in Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries were only for male voices. Church documents from the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries prohibit women from singing in church. In the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, choir schools were set up in churches such as St. Paul's Cathedral in London and St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, where Johann Sebastian Bach would work many later, but they were only for male voices. In the 15th century, Canterbury Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and the Chapel Royal established choirs for men and boys. At this same time, the Sistine Chapel Choir was formed in Rome with 24 adult male voices singing a cappella music. Of course, a cappella means in the style of the church. In 1599, the Sistine Chapel Choir employed the first Italian castrato. For those of you who don't know what a castrato is a male who is physiologically altered in a way that his voice will never change. So he will sing the soprano range the whole of his life. This practice continued in Italy until 1903. As with many things in history, there is one exception that I was able to find. His name is Paul of Samosata, the Bishop of Antioch from 260 to 268 AD, who, quote, trained women to sing psalms himself, end quote. Now, in church history, there are a few examples of times when women were allowed to sing in church. And this was exclusively at times when men were not present. For example, in convents and with groups of nuns. Hildegard von Bingen is one of these women who created church music outside of the eyes of men. Hildegard was the abbess of a Benedictine community in an area that's now known as Germany. Though she lived in the medieval period, she was certainly a Renaissance woman. She absolutely excelled as a writer, a composer, a philosopher, a Christian mystic, a visionary, and a polymath. In addition to composing songs for female choirs, presumably nuns in her monastery, she wrote texts on theology, botany, and medicine. Her best-known musical work is called Ordo Virtutum, which translates to Play of the Virtues. It's a morality play telling the Christian story of sin, confession, repentance, and forgiveness. The play is interesting in that it is the female virtues who restore the fallen to the community of the faithful, not the patriarchs or prophets. In Venice, Italy, choirs of female voices were all the rage from 1525 until 1797. Many famous composers were involved in the music scene in Venice, including the Gabriellis, Monteverdi, and Antonio Vivaldi, who taught music at a school for girls. Though Venice permitted women and girls to sing in church, they were forced to sing in choir lofts that were very high, and they were covered with a screen so that you couldn't see their faces. Male collaborators, such as trumpeters, who, according to Venetian guild rules, were required to be men, and other instrumentalists had to perform from separate areas of the church. They couldn't be in the same loft as the women. In France, some royal chapels began to employ women soloists as early as 1650. Michel Richard Delalande was the director of music at the Sainte-Chappelle. He employed his own wife and daughters to sing professionally at the chapel. In Germany, Lutheran congregations began to integrate women into their musical life. While he was working in Arnstadt, Johann Sebastian Bach got in trouble for allowing a, quote, fremde Jungfer, or strange/foreign young thing, into the organ loft unchaperoned. This may have been his fiancée. Bach's choirs did not admit women. They were only men and boys. And Bach's final post at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig did not admit women until 1940. In Hamburg, Barbara and Margareta Kaiser were the first women to sing as members of a church choir. Barbara was introduced to the congregation by Johann Mattheson from the organ loft as, quote, the new sound of a female voice, end quote, in 1716. In the 1720s, more and more Protestants advocated for women to be added to their choirs. German and Austrian court chapels began to employ small numbers of women in their choirs. By the mid-19th century, composers were advocating for more women to be incorporated into more and more venues. The Musical Times advertised for female sopranos and a female contralto for a London church. Female organists, though not yet choir directors, became more common at this time. female church musicians became common enough to be mentioned in literature. The Incumbent of Axhill, the second of Mary Leith's chorister novels, includes a plotline of a new minister of an Anglican parish, making life difficult for the female organist, so that she will quit and he can form a choir of men and boys. In the U.S., the story is a bit different. Mixed gender singing has been a part of our history since colonial times. Colonial singing schools allowed men and women, including the unmarried ones, to sit next to each other in rehearsals. Methodists and Shakers actually encouraged this. In 1876, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, the Roman Catholic Cathedral of the Archdiocese of New York, began allowing women to sing for Mass. However, this practice ceased in 1903 after a papal order was issued excluding women from singing with men. In his defense, the Archbishop of New York went to the Vatican and petitioned the Pope to allow women to sing once more, but Pope Pius X just would not have it. As an interesting historical side note, newspapers such as the Baltimore Sun ran columns that were called Your Favorite Soloist columns to assist people to find these soloists that they had come to enjoy hearing in Catholic Church. But they found new jobs and new congregations, usually Protestant congregations or Reformed Jewish synagogues. In 1953, another papal document was issued allowing women to sing once again in church, but not from the sanctuary. They could not sing at the front of the church. They had to sing off to the side or at the back or in the loft. In 1983, the Roman Catholic Church finally passed a canon law that decreed that, quote, all lay persons can fulfill the functions of commentator or singer. This relaxation of the rules in the Roman Catholic Church had ramifications for Anglicans as well. In England, in Ireland, and in the United States, choirs of girls and men began to be formed beginning in the 1980s. Women actually began to be integrated into choirs in the secular realm of music before they were permitted to join church choirs. Since many composers composed for both the church and the stage, they were indoctrinated into the idea of having women sing before people in the church. The composers saw the benefit of admitting women to choirs even when the clergy and laity in the pews of the church were stalwarts for the traditions of male-only singing. George Frederick Handel's oratorios, such as Messiah or Elijah, have many similarities to opera, but they are concert pieces with religious subjects rather than staged pieces, and these may have served as bridges to the church. These oratorios employed female soloists, though the choirs were all male. Another composer, Mozart, whose wife Costanza performed the soprano solo with an all-male choir in Salzburg for the debut of Mozart's Mass in C. It caused quite a scandal. Both Mozart and Haydn wrote parts for women soprano soloists, but did not incorporate women into the chorus parts. And finally, we get to Beethoven, and the premiere of his Missa Solemnis included women in both the soprano and alto sections of the choir. Around 1820, some composers were beginning to stop using the term alto and write two soprano parts, or a soprano and a mezzo-soprano part, to indicate that these parts were to be sung by women rather than males who were meant to sing the tenor or bass parts. It was during this time period that the term contralto began to be used to identify a female alto. Of course, by 2021, much has changed. Women are ordained as deacons, priests, and bishops in most parts of the Anglican Communion, but not all. These days, women are, of course, becoming directors of music and organists in some of the major churches. Jennifer Pasquale is the director of music at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where 100 years ago women were prohibited from even singing. Of course, there's also my beloved mentor, Gail Walton, who was the director of music at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart at the University of Notre Dame. Gail was a pioneer in her field. She was the first woman to hold the position of director of music at the Basilica, and she certainly paved the way for many musicians to follow after her. Yes, we still have a long ways to go before we achieve any sort of equality of the sexes in the field of church music. Having said that, in the next couple of weeks, I hope to highlight some of the exceptional women who have indeed found their way into church music. Instead of playing something for you myself this week, I'm going to include a link in the description box below to the music from a concert given by Sarah Macdonald and the Selwyn Consort that includes music from Hildegard von Bingen as well as other female composers. Sarah was very kind and sent me the narration for this concert, which provided a lot of information for this Music Monday, so I hope you'll definitely give that concert a listen. That's it for this week on Music Monday. Happy Women's History Month, and I'll see you soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.